Thank you, Adam. It's always great to see you, and thank you, Ed. I remember the first time I came to Heritage to give a talk, Adam came and picked me up at the airport, and Adam, I don't know how long ago that was, maybe 12 years now, and it's been just terrific, and thank you. I'm honored to be back amongst friends at this wonderful organization. I'm honored to be a trustee. To me, the Heritage Foundation is the Phi Beta Kappa of intellectual think tanks. No professional relationship, and Adam was very nice to go through my curriculum vitae, but no professional relationship has given me greater satisfaction over the years than my service and association with the Heritage Foundation. I'm in awe, Ed, of the work that you and all your colleagues do. Day in and day out, Heritage is the ultimate teacher of America's bedrock principles. And you know, great teachers, Ronald Reagan once said, preserve our heritage from being consumed by forgetfulness and our future from being engulfed by ignorance. And that's what you all do. Better than any other organization, the Heritage Foundation provides the proof that the greatest power on earth is the power of free people, free markets, and free ideas. Now, of course, that conviction is being severely challenged in our brave new world of hope and change. Hope and change. Now, exactly what do those terms mean? Well, we've only had 6 months, but we're beginning to find out. It means appointing more czars than the Romanovs, accountable to nobody. It means quadrupling our debt, government motors, nationalized banks, government-run health care, mounting attacks on energy and insurance companies, cable TV, and now on the American people themselves. Excuse me, have I left anybody out? We've gone from change you can believe in to change that perhaps our country will have trouble surviving. Who ever thought that we'd look back on the days of Jimmy Carter as the good old days? And now, of course, every morning it seems we wake up to yet one more peril to our precious freedom. Today, I've come to Heritage to ask you for your help, because freedom, as Adam mentioned, is under assault on yet another front, and that's the front of philanthropy all across America. Here again, a private sphere where traditionally individuals have been free to choose how and when to make their donations is under attack. It's under siege by activists who insist that government must have the power and government must decide where our philanthropic dollars go and how they must be spent. One group, the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, has called for benchmarks to assess foundation performance. We'll talk about that in a second. One member of Congress, Xavier Becerra, from my home state of California, has compared the tax-exempt status of foundations to a $32 billion earmark. Becerra vowed that government must assure that funds that are privately raised advance, quote, the public interest, end quote. Now, you only have to mention words like the public interest or government solution, and you'll hear the knees of Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi jerking. But the rest of us should be very concerned. At stake now is one of the great and enduring hallmarks of American civilization. Permit me to give you just a little background. The word philanthropy comes from the Greek word for love of mankind. The actual practice of philanthropy is rooted in the Jewish notion of tzedakah and in the Christian notions of caritas and charity, both of which had an overriding emphasis on care of the poor and oppressed. And America historically has carried forward this philanthropic tradition through two great institutional contributions. One is the Voluntary Association, pioneered by the evangelicals in the 19th century, and the second, as you all know, is the modern foundation, pioneered by individuals like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. As you know, Andrew Carnegie was an enormously successful businessman, making his wealth in providing iron and steel to the railways in the 19th century. But Carnegie answered to a higher calling. So he sat down and he wrote a book that all of you are familiar with and was a favorite of my dad's called A Gospel of Wealth. And in the Gospel of Wealth, Carnegie set forth his theory that those who have been blessed with wealth have three duties. First, they must set an example of modest living, shunning display or extravagance. Second, they should provide modestly for those that are dependent upon them. And third, that they should administer all surplus in a manner that provides the most benefits for the community. So in Carnegie's eyes, men and women of wealth must in effect become agents and trustees for their poorer brethren. They must provide their best wisdom, experience, and administrative abilities. These great traditions have been passed down now for almost 100 years. They are uniquely American, making us the most generous people on earth. They represent a mighty river of generosity, carrying American abundance all across the fruited plain. American wealth has built in many communities the lion's share of our public libraries, hospitals, museums, colleges, and universities. And it contributes in many ways, too many to mention, to good works all across our country. In 2007 alone, our citizens gave away a staggering $306 billion. My friends, this is the heart of America. Yet, the left, as it so often does, heaps scorn on this great American success story. What the left wants to do is politicize philanthropy, to put it under the thumb of groups with political power and influence. The left would wreck philanthropy's independence, both as a check on government and as an alternative source of government funding. David Billett recently wrote an outstanding article in Commentary magazine, and I'd like to quote briefly from it. David wrote, "The war on philanthropy that appears to be developing is a challenge to the vitality of our civil society and a serious threat to the non-governmental mediating institutions that have always been a particular hallmark and glory of our American history and tradition. Even before Obama's rise, philanthropists and nonprofits were feeling the heat from Washington and governments at the state and local level. In the year 2006, with the passage of the Pension Protection Act by Congress, they issued hundreds of new rules on philanthropic entities, rules that covered everything from the proper valuation of gifts of taxidermy property to exemptions for blood collecting organizations, from regular excise taxes on heavy vehicles and fuel to limits on tax exemptions for gifts to IRAs. More recently, religious organizations like charitable hospitals that receive government funding in the form of Medicaid reimbursements are coming under pressure to provide family planning services to those in a manner in which they conscientiously object. So if they heed their conscience, basically they are at risk of losing their government funding. Other regulations are now being floated today in the Senate, like requiring nonprofit hospitals further to prove their bona fides by bestowing a greater percentage of their services on the poor, end quote. So the left has clearly shown their hand. What do we need to do? Well, I see philanthropy resting on three pillars, and I believe that we need a strategy to reinforce each of these three pillars. We need a strategy not just to repel the left's assault, but to reinforce the power of our philanthropic traditions. So let me propose a three-part strategy that, in keeping with the practice of heritage, combines ideas with action. First, we need to reinforce the idea that American philanthropy is rooted in freedom. And without freedom, there can be no viable philanthropy. Second, we need to remind the American people that our personal, political, and economic freedoms are inextricably intertwined, so that when one is attacked, all our freedoms are in jeopardy. And third, we need a call to action to invest in the moral foundations of freedom and the free enterprise system, and to stop subsidizing those who would tear it down. Let's begin with our lodestar, which of course is freedom. American philanthropy and foundations must remain rooted in freedom. Without freedom's life-giving roots, they will die. Once government takes away our liberty to give money to the groups we choose for the causes we believe in, we would be a fool to set up a foundation. Your organization would be sitting on death row, unless, of course, you want to reflect the ideological bias of the members of Congress and advocacy groups like the NCRP. As an example, the NCRP would require that 25% of their of all grant dollars go to advocacy, organizing, and civil engagement, so as to promote, in their words, equity, opportunity, and justice in our society. As my dad used to say, beautiful. Not only that, after you get finished with that 25% tax, the NCRP would also require foundations to designate 50% of their grants to, and I quote, lower income communities, communities of color, and other marginalized groups broadly defined, end quote. That's 50%. So 25%, 50%, 75% of all foundation dollars would go to places that you might not want them to go to. These two requirements alone would drastically alter and reduce charitable giving. It would be putting your money where their mouth is. Now, of course, reducing poverty is a primary goal of many fine organizations. However, it is not the only goal. Investment in disease research, for example, may not be viewed as naturally benefiting low-income communities. But a cure for a major illness benefits everyone, and often low-income communities even more because they have less access to effective care. When programs encourage entrepreneurship, their effects, as we all know, ripple through society. The entrepreneur's race, gender, or background should not matter if the result is better health, thriving businesses, and new jobs. And there's also a larger point here. It is un-American to dictate how someone must donate their money. Not only un-American, but unacceptable, don't you think? Let us declare then with no ambiguity that every person has the right to fund their own choices, and no government or activist has the right to dictate otherwise. The second major point is that our freedoms are inextricably intertwined. That is another way of saying that the fight to preserve freedom in philanthropy, to preserve freedom for foundations, is just one battle in the larger war to safeguard all our freedoms. And my father never tired of repeating this timeless truth, and I can still hear his voice today, warning that history is littered with the wreckage of countries which foolishly sought security by sacrificing their economic freedoms, only to see all of their freedoms, economic, personal, and political, buried in a common grave. Of course, this loss of freedoms does not happen overnight, and we can be lulled into a false sense of complacency. James Madison said, and I quote, "I believe that there are more instances of the abridgment of freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachment of those in power than by violent and sudden usurpations." End quote. What's remarkable to me about the last 6 months is that these encroachments are no longer gradual, secret, or unseen. They're swift, massive, and in full view. Government started by setting salaries of banks participating in TARP, but now we learn that they want to set salaries in lots of other industries as well. In autos and energy, Obama cites global warming, even as the earth is cooling, as his pretext for control more and more of our decisions and actions. Government today is elbowing its way into one market after another to influence how we invest our capital, produce our energy, purchase our cars, and heat our homes and enterprises. In healthcare, The American people are now learning, thanks in no small part to the magnificent work of the Heritage Foundation, that letting government set the rules may be the equivalent of a poison pill. And swallow that pill, and you'll see bureaucrats between doctors and their patients. We'll see medical care, procedures, and life-saving drugs being rationed. We'll see government wielding ultimate power over our most personal decisions of life and death. And please, don't insult our intelligence by denying government's intention to make these fateful decisions. We know that they will. And now, when Americans rise up in full-throated protest, how do our political leaders respond? They berate the American people. They urge us to snitch on our neighbors, to send email addresses of friends and neighbors to Big Brother, while attacking anyone in the media who stands in their way. So I repeat, ladies and gentlemen, government encroaches upon our economic liberties. All of our liberties, personal, political, and charitable, are at risk. The fight to preserve freedom is but one battle in a larger war, a battle against those who arrogantly assumed that their superior wisdom entitles them to make the most fundamental decisions that concern the lives and livelihood of the American people, and to assign to themselves the role of defining what is meant by the term public interest. These are the core ideas that we must reaffirm, and we must be able to reaffirm them in the world of philanthropy as much as in the political sphere and in the economic sphere. The third element of our strategy must be to transform our ideas, as Heritage has shown over the years, into action. As we defend our freedom to give, we have a responsibility to invest. We need to invest in our philanthropies and our foundations. We need to build up the moral capital of freedom in our free enterprise system. So let me briefly mention what I believe are the principal moral foundations of freedom. First, certainly is private property, because it empowers the individual and inspires personal responsibility and a pride of accomplishment. Private property also disperses power and decisions, unlike the isms of socialism, fascism, and I would add now, thanks to Obama and his colleagues, corporate welfareism. Next is limited government. Limited government was the bedrock principle of the founders when they established our republic and wrote our Constitution. Have you ever noticed that our friends on the left love to mention Thomas Jefferson as one of their own, but they rarely cite anything that Thomas Jefferson said? So let me quote our third president. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "Still one more thing, fellow citizens, a wise and frugal government, which shall restrain men from injuring one another, which shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. This is the sum of good government." Thus wrote Thomas Jefferson, and I say amen. In his time, President Reagan loved to remind Americans that a government program was the closest thing to eternal life on earth. He also likened government spending to a baby. It has unlimited appetite on one end and no sense of responsibility on the other. So our goal must be to limit every dollar that government can tax, spend, or borrow, because every dollar that's left in the hands of the people will make us more productive, more prosperous, and more free. Strong values and strong families are also key parts of freedom's moral foundation. When we look first to the needs of our sons and daughters, when it's their future that engages our planning and policies and passions, we will be less prone to succumb to selfish indulgence. And we will be adding to the well of savings, investment, and moral capital. Honorable standards of conduct are vital, because only where there is integrity and square dealing can there be trust. Trust that people and businesses will keep their word. Trust that they will honor their commitments and contracts and respect the ethics of competition. And finally, we must reaffirm a success ethic that rewards the achievements of individuals and entrepreneurs to learn, work, succeed, and excel. And when they excel, we need to allow them to be free to give away their hard-earned profits in whatever way that they choose. In his epic book, Wealth and Poverty, George Gilder extolled entrepreneurs as the heroes of the modern age. Now, I know I'm preaching to the choir when I say that the bold and creative genius of entrepreneurs represent humanity's greatest hope for overcoming poverty and conflict, much as Adam mentioned with the recent passage of Norman Borlaug. Yet, in this current climate, the appeals that we are hearing are appeals to envy, attacks on wealth, and entrepreneurs being scapegoated or ignored. Well, these attacks, as you all know, are not new. It seems like every generation, a new volley is aimed at our freedoms. It was that way in 1978 when my father wrote A Time for Truth during the Carter years. He beseeched American business to fight back and to stop subsidizing universities whose faculties were churning out young collectivists by the dozens. Irving Kristol, who was a prominent intellectual in that period, said that the attacks against freedom were generated by what he called a new class of academics, journalists, and people working in government, people who sought to undermine the underpinnings which made that unrivaled prosperity possible to begin with. And so, freedom's defenders fought back. Great organizations like Heritage, Cato, the John M. Olin Foundation came together to make common cause. Men and women of ideas joined men and women of action in the business world and politics with our great Captain Ronald Reagan at the helm. The result, as you know, was a great and historic triumph. The renaissance of freedom that gave birth to transformative policies. Those ideas and policies not only defeated freedom's enemies, but also unleashed an unprecedented outpouring of innovation, jobs, prosperity, and wealth. In short, we all remembered that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. And so we roused ourselves, and so we now must do that again. We must defend freedom now. The time has come to mount the ramparts again. People are yearning to re-embrace the great principles of our founders. Heritage will help lead the way, teaching, reaching out, working with allies across the spectrum, and investing in the moral foundations of our great country. I have every confidence that we can triumph again, because I believe in the power of the American spirit and the power of freedom. Together, we can turn over to our children and our children's children a world that is stronger and better economically, financially, morally, and spiritually. Thank you, and God bless you.